Hey everyone, so I don't have anything to write on a whiteboard or anything like that in this video. We're just going to go over a little bit of definitions and explanations about what we're going to be covering in this next set of videos. So previously, you should have seen some videos on UML, UML diagrams. It's really important that you understand those because when you get to this book here, which is the Design Patterns, Elements of Reusable Object-Oriented Software, by Gamma, Helm, Johnson, and Vlasides. I hope I said that right. This is the Gang of Four book. Try to make that a little bit clearer. So this is the Gang of Four design pattern book. It is super popular. It is super old, and it's still a great book. And the reason why I say that is this book was originally published, as far as I'm aware, in 1995. That's how old the copyright is. All right, so 1995, and this still is basically the book on design patterns. Now, I know you don't know what design patterns are yet. That's okay. We're going to cover that in a minute. This is a really important book. Make sure you have it. Make sure you're reading it. It's great reference material even after this class is over. But you need to understand the UML diagrams in order to understand the diagrams in this book because they use UML. And it's not that you need to necessarily be able to draw every single UML diagram. In fact, the most important UML diagrams that you're going to need are the class and object diagrams. And it's helpful to have the sequence and understand them, but you're not necessarily going to have to draw those. You will need to understand how to draw those class and object diagrams, though. So again, Gang of Four book, make sure you get it. So that covers why we were discussing UML, or at least why I gave you a bunch of videos on UML that I did not make in the previous lecture set. And what's going to happen in this series is we're going to talk about design patterns. So what is a design pattern? A design pattern is essentially a pattern of code, of structure of code or behavior of code that allows us to solve problems that have existed before. Basically, it's kind of like having, if any of you have sewn before or understand any bit of sewing, when you go to sew something, you have a pattern that you're following. At least if you're not sewing, off of memory or off of skill, right? You have a pattern that you follow about this is how you sew. This is what you cut out. This is where you sew. This is the type of seam you use. It tells you all of that kind of stuff. That's really helpful. Design patterns are kind of like having a blueprint for a house. It tells you exactly how to solve a particular problem, right? In the case of a house, it's telling you how to build a house. Maybe with a little bit more abstraction, but a design pattern is a blueprint or a pattern for code. All right. And the reason why this is important is because there's nothing new under the sun, as people like to tell me all the time, which means that there is no problem that you have seen that hasn't been seen before. All right. And that's almost certainly true in code. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to be able to find a solution that exists out there for every single problem you come across. You're going to have to develop your own solutions, absolutely. That's absolutely true. But what's unique about programming is that we do get to reuse a lot of at least the structure design of our code in a lot of these problems. And that's where design patterns come in, right? So design patterns, again, really good book here, helps us to identify what kind of things we can solve with existing solutions. Now, this doesn't mean that we're going to have the exact code we can just plug in and use. No, this is about how we architect our code, how we design our code, how do we build our code to be effective, to solve these problems. This is the engineering part of software engineering, right? So you're thinking computer science, you're thinking software engineering. They're kind of the same field, right? Well, they're not quite. Computer science is more theory. It's about how do we do things, about how computation works, about how computers work in that computational aspect. You can do a whole bunch of computer science without ever touching programming. You can't do that as well for software engineering. Software engineering is about design, it's about building, it's about executing solutions. So it's computer science to software engineering is kind of like chemistry to chemical engineering, right? So we have a field, something that has a lot of theory. There's practical aspects to it too, but engineering is specifically that application of that theory to problems. Design patterns help us do that. They help us apply computer science, they help us apply programming to particular problems. And we're going to talk about a couple different types of design patterns. We're actually going to talk about 3 types of design patterns. And if you go to the table of contents section of your book, I don't know how well you can see this, there are basically 3 types of design patterns that this book talks about. So the first section here is the introduction, right? The second section here we have is a case study on a particular problem, in this case a design a document editor. And then the third section is going to be the design pattern catalog. And that's the part we're going to focus on. You do need to read the chapter 1, which has the introduction to things and talks about design patterns. It talks about an MVC design pattern, by the way, in there, which stands for Model View Controller, which is not explicitly talked about in this book, but it is talked about in this book, which is the other book for this course, the Absolute Java book. All right. So make sure you read the chapter out of there for design patterns. It's a lot smaller than a lot of the other chapters, but it does talk about the MVC in a little bit more detail. We will be needing to cover that. So at some point you do need to read that. But in this book, we're going to be talking about the creational, structural, and behavioral design patterns that it presents. The creational patterns is basically how do we create objects, how do we create particular instances of things. And the one that you're going to really talk about in this section is going to be the singleton and the factory, and that's where we're starting. So you're going to learn about the singleton and factory creational design patterns in the next upcoming videos. And then we're going to talk about some structural and behavioral problems sometime in the future. I'm not going to commit to when we're going to cover those, but we will talk about some of them. The structural patterns are about how we structure our code, how we design and structure our code bases, and how we work with the structure of our code, which sounds a little bit abstract, I know. Just bear with me. And then we have behavioral patterns, which talk about how our objects behave. So how our code is supposed to behave, how we're going to design it. Now, these design patterns, while this is a object-oriented, it says it right here, object-oriented software, it does not mean that these only exist in an object-oriented setting. They also exist in procedural or functional settings as well. So it's important that these concepts are translatable to other languages and other programming paradigms, but they are mostly used in object-oriented programming. All right, so again, creational is about how we create objects, how we manage those objects. Structural is about how we structure our code, how we structure different aspects of our code. And behavioral is about how things behave. So let's see, an example of the creational we're going to talk about today. So that's singleton and factory. And then we have, for structural, we'll talk about things like an adapter. So we'll talk about those much later. Don't worry, we will talk about adapters. And the name, it sounds like an adapter for your phone, right? Or for your outlet. If you're, traveling overseas, you need a different type of plug. You might have an adapter to convert from one type to another type of plug. That's basically what an adapter is in this design pattern. And then we have behavioral, so that's going to be things like, let's look here. The observer is a good example of that, or a state it helps us to monitor and manage the behavior of our application, which is what the purpose of a behavioral design pattern is. All right, so we're going to be talking about these moving forward in this course. This is going to be a pretty large aspect of the course. You need to understand these. Today, you're going to watch some videos with some examples, not from me. They're going to be from some other people, and they're really, really good. And they go over them. So there's one video talking about the theory and general application of the pattern, and then there's going to be one talking about actually programming it, and that's going to be both for the singleton and for the factory. If you have any questions, make sure that you're putting those questions out on Teams, or you're otherwise, sending those questions to me so that we can get those questions answered. Make sure that you're, getting any questions you have clarified. This lecture series is a little bit longer than normal, but it should still be within our normal lecture limit. So don't get discouraged. I know it's a little bit longer, but you'll be able to get through it, and it's really, really important material. And when you get to reading them from this book, there's quite a few pieces of information here that is really important, and I'm just going to go over what some of them are. So you do want to read the first section bit of each of these. So I'm just showing an example here of creational. There's a discussion section about what those types of patterns are for. So that gives you a little bit more of the background knowledge about it. And then the next thing that you're going to see is you're going to see each of the types of patterns. So both at the beginning and end of those chapters, there's some information, but in the middle, the important part here, so this is the factory, there we go, that's what I was looking for. The factory method here, and I don't know how well you can see that again, but it talks about the intent, so the purpose behind the pattern, other names that pattern might be known by, why we'd want to use that pattern, where we can apply it, the structure, which has UML diagrams, the participants, so what kind of things participate in that particular design pattern. There's collaborators, so other types of design patterns that exist within that. Consequences is a really, really important section. And then we also have some implementation, which I think uses some form of C code, not entirely certain, but it's not Java, so don't directly try to try to copy the book's code into your Java programs. That's not going to work. But it is a good kind of like pseudocode example of what you're going to need to do. And so there is an implementation section in here. But again, I'm always going to give you a tutorial video that talks about how to go about programming it with the lecture videos. So there is a sample code section which has all that code that is talked about in that implementation, and there's some known uses and related patterns. So that's all really, really useful information. This is a great piece of reference for this course and for design patterns in general. And yes, you're not going to hear these talked about a lot in industry, but they're still useful to know because you're going to come across a problem and you're going to be like, oh, I can use that design pattern, and maybe you don't need to come back and look exactly how that design pattern works, but you're going to have an idea of pre-existing solutions, pre-existing designs that are tried and true that you can use in your applications. So it's good knowledge to have. There's a good reference to have, and it's really good to understand why you would use these different things. All right, so again, the next videos you're going to watch are on the singleton design pattern and the factory design pattern.